The fire in the sky above Isstvan III was not a sun. It was a weapon. The planet burned from pole to pole. Billions of people screamed at once, but the sound died before it could reach the stars. On the bridge of the vengeful spirit, the Warmaster watched the flames. He did not smile, he did not frown. He simply watched the death of a world that had trusted him. The virus bombs dissolved flesh in seconds. Great cities turned into sludge. The atmosphere caught fire and incinerated everything that was left. It was the greatest crime in human history, and it happened in silence. The psychic scream of the dying world hit the warp like a hammer. Far away on Terra, the lamps flickered. In a high tower of the Imperial Palace, the air turned cold. Sigillite Holmes sat in his chair. He was a man of logic in an age of magic. He wore a grey robe that smelled of old paper and chemical dust. His eyes were grey and sharp, like the edge of a scalpel. He did not look at the storm outside his window. He looked at the data slate in his hands. The numbers were wrong. They were always wrong lately. Logistics reports from the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet showed too much ammunition used for a training exercise. Medical supplies were being hoarded. Communications were looping. It was a pattern, and Holmes hated patterns that he could not explain. He tapped a finger on his desk. The rhythm was fast and nervous. A man named Watson stood by the door. Watson was a former soldier with a bionic leg that clicked when the weather changed. He carried a heavy bolter pistol under his coat. He worried about Holmes. He worried about the lack of sleep and the strange stim injectors Holmes used to stay awake. Watson cleared his throat. He asked if the news was bad. Holmes did not answer right away. He stood up and walked to the wall covered in maps. He traced a line from Terra to the Isstvan system. The line was red. Holmes said the silence was the loudest thing he had ever heard. The fleets were not reporting in. The astropaths were having seizures. Something massive had broken the chain of command. Holmes picked up a piece of paper. It was a list of ships. 4 legions were supposed to be bringing order to the Isstvan system, but the supply requests were for virus bombs. The request had been buried deep in the administrative logs, hidden under code names and false approvals. But Holmes had found it. He always found the small things. The Imperium was a machine of 1,000,000 moving parts. When one part broke, it made a noise. This noise was a scream. Holmes looked at Watson. He said the game was afoot. But it was not a game. It was a slaughter. He grabbed his coat. The data slate glowed with a single, terrifying truth. The Warmaster was not just conquering a system. He was hiding a murder. Holmes knew they had to leave the tower. They had to find the truth before the fire reached Terra. The shadow of the Warmaster was long, and it was falling over the throne itself. The shuttle ride to the Phalanx was long and cold. Sigillite Holmes sat perfectly still. He did not look out the thick glass window. He stared at the metal floor. His mind was moving faster than the ship. Beside him, Watson adjusted his heavy coat. Watson was nervous. His bionic leg ached in the damp air of the shuttle. He looked out the window. The Phalanx was not just a ship. It was a fortress made of gold and stone that floated in the dark. It was the size of a small moon. It was the home of Rogal Dorn, the Praetorian of Terra. To see it was to feel small. Watson felt very small. He looked at Holmes. Holmes looked tired. The dark circles under his eyes were deep. He had not slept in 3 days. He was reading a stack of paper reports. The paper was yellow and old. The Imperium used data slates, but Holmes liked paper. He said paper did not lie. He said data could be hacked, but ink was honest. The shuttle docked with a heavy thud. The clamps locked into place. The airlock hissed. Steam filled the room. A voice boomed over the speakers. It told them to stand still. It told them to show their identification. Watson checked his pistol. It was hidden, but he felt better knowing it was there. The door opened. Two giants stood there. They were Imperial fists. Their armor was yellow like the sun. They held bolters across their chests. They did not move. They looked like statues. But statues did not breathe. These men breathed with a deep mechanical sound. Holmes stood up. He smoothed his grey robe. He picked up his wooden staff. He walked past the giants without looking up. Watson followed him. He tried not to limp. They walked down a hall that was built for tanks, not men. The ceiling was high above them. Banners hung from the walls. They listed names of battles won. The floor was polished stone. Their footsteps echoed. Watson felt like an intruder. He was a soldier, but these were Space Marines. They were the Emperor's angels. They were perfect. Holmes stopped at a junction. A servitor floated by. It was a machine made from a man. Its eyes were gone, replaced by red lenses. It scanned them and floated away. Holmes turned left. He knew the way. He had memorized the blueprints of the phalanx before they left Terra. He knew every vent and every door. They reached a massive set of doors. They were made of bronze and adamantium. A captain stood guard. He took off his helmet. His face was scarred and hard. He looked at Holmes. He asked for the code. Holmes gave it. It was a clearance code from Malcador the Sigillite. The captain frowned. He did not like spies. He did not like secrets. But he obeyed the code. The doors opened slowly. The room inside was a sphere. It was a command center. Screens covered the walls. Hundreds of crew members worked in pits below the walkways. In the center of the room stood a throne, and on the throne sat Rogal Dorn. Dorn was huge. He was bigger than the other Space Marines. His armor was gold and covered in eagles. His face was like a cliff face, stern and unmoving. He did not look happy. He was reading a data slate. He crushed the slate in his hand. Pieces of glass and metal fell to the floor. He looked at Holmes. His voice was like grinding stones. He asked why the Sigillite had sent a mortal to his ship. Holmes bowed slightly. He said he was there to observe. He said there were reports of a ship arriving from the warp. A ship that claimed to have news. Dorn snorted. He said the ship was the Eisenstein. He said it was a Death Guard ship. He said the captain claimed Horus was a traitor. Dorn said this was impossible. He said Horus was the Warmaster. Horus was the best of them. To call him a traitor was madness. It was a lie. Holmes walked closer. He was not afraid. He asked to see the ship. Dorn narrowed his eyes. He said the Eisenstein was damaged. It was drifting near the edge of the system. He had sent a team to secure it. He was going to execute the captain for spreading lies. Holmes tapped his staff on the floor. He said execution was final. He said truth was often ugly. He asked for 1 hour on the ship. He wanted to see the evidence before the captain died. Dorn was silent. He looked at Watson. Watson tried to stand tall. Dorn looked back at Holmes. He nodded once. He gave them 1 hour. They took a Thunderhawk gunship to the Eisenstein. The flight was rough. The pilot flew fast. Watson held onto his seat. Holmes looked at the sensor readings. The Eisenstein was a wreck. Its engines were cold. Its hull was burned. It looked like it had flown through hell. The gunship landed in a hangar bay that had been blown open to the void. Magnetic fields kept the air inside. They walked down the ramp. The gravity was low. Watson felt light. The air smelled terrible. It smelled of burnt metal and something sweet. It smelled like rotting meat. Watson covered his nose. Holmes took a deep breath. He categorized the smell. Ozone, cordite, coagulated blood, and something else, something distinct. They met the survivors in the cargo bay. There were 70 of them. They were Space Marines, but their armor was not yellow. It was unpainted grey, the color of the Death Guard. They looked awful. Their armor was cracked. Their bolters were empty. They sat on crates or on the floor. They did not look like conquerors. They looked like refugees. A man stood up to meet them. He had a shaved head and a noble face. He was Captain Nathaniel Garrow. He looked at Holmes. He saw the Sigillite symbol. He nodded. He said he had a message for the Emperor. He said his brothers had betrayed him. Holmes did not ask for the message yet. He walked past Garrow. He walked to a wall. There were bullet holes in the metal. Holmes touched the holes. He took out a small magnifying glass. He looked at the edges of the metal. The holes were large. They were made by mass-reactive bolts, the kind only Space Marines used. He looked at the angle of the shots. He looked at the floor. There were scratch marks, deep gouges in the steel. Holmes knelt down. He ran his gloved finger along the scratch. He found a fragment of ceramite. It was green, sea green, the color of the sons of Horus. Watson watched the survivors. He saw their eyes. They had seen something that broke them. Space Marines were not supposed to feel fear, but these men had fear in their eyes. Watson walked over to a pile of gear. He saw a helmet. The lens was shattered. He saw a sword that was notched and dull. He realized these men had been fighting for days. They had no supplies. Their rations were gone. He felt a pang of pity. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ration bar. He offered it to a soldier sitting nearby. The giant looked at the bar. He looked at Watson. He took it gently. He nodded. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Holmes stood up. He called Garrow over. He asked about the enemy. Garrow spoke of Isstvan III. He spoke of the virus bombs. He told them how the Warmaster had gathered the loyalist elements of 4 legions on the planet. He told them how the fleet opened fire. He told them how the World Eaters and the Sons of Horus descended to slaughter the survivors. Holmes listened. He did not interrupt. He watched Garrow's face. He looked for micro-expressions. He looked for signs of deception. There were none. Garrow was telling the truth, or at least he believed it was the truth. But Holmes needed more. He needed proof that Dorn would accept. He asked to see the ship's log. Garrow led them to the bridge. The bridge was dark. Emergency lights flickered red. The main view screen was cracked. Garrow typed a code into a console. A holographic image appeared. It was a recording. It showed the surface of a planet. It showed cities. Then it showed the fire that ate the world. Watson gasped. He had seen war. He had seen orbital bombardments. But this was different. This was extermination. The fire moved like a living thing. It turned the planet into a skull. Holmes watched the recording 3 times. He checked the timestamps. He checked the star charts in the background of the video. He calculated the position of the fleet. He pulled out his own data slate. He compared the energy signatures of the bombardment to known Imperial weaponry. It was the Life Eater virus. The use of the virus required authorization from the highest levels. Holmes knew the supply manifests. He knew that Horus had requested these warheads months ago. At the time, it seemed like a standard request for a dangerous campaign. Now, it was the murder weapon. Then Holmes saw something else in the video. In the corner of the frame, there was a ship. It was the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship. It was firing on the planet, but it was also firing on other ships, Imperial ships. Holmes paused the image. He zoomed in. The pixels were blurry, but the shape was clear. A Thunderhawk gunship was trying to escape the surface. It was shot down by a lance strike from the vengeful spirit. This was the final proof. Horus was not just killing a planet. He was killing his own men to hide the crime. Holmes turned to Garrow. He asked one question. He asked why they fled. Garrow said they had to warn Terra. He said they were chased. He said something followed them into the warp. Holmes looked at the walls of the bridge. He saw a strange residue. It was like black oil, but it was dry. He scraped a bit off with his knife. He put it in a vial. He did not like the way it looked. It seemed to absorb the light. He put the vial in his pocket. He told Watson they were leaving. They had the evidence. The flight back to the Phalanx was silent. Holmes stared at the vial in his pocket. He was thinking. He was connecting the dots. The missing supplies. The silence from the astropaths. The horde of virus bombs. The behavior of the Mechanicum factions allied with Horus. It was a conspiracy of massive scale. It had been planned for years. Holmes felt a cold dread. This was not a rebellion. This was a coup, and they were already losing. They returned to the throne room. Dorn was waiting. He stood up when they entered. He looked at Garrow, who had come with them. Dorn's hand rested on the pommel of his massive sword. He looked ready to strike. He asked Holmes for his report. He asked if the man was a liar. Holmes stepped forward. He did not bow this time. He held up the data slate. He projected the image of the burning planet onto the main screen. The room went silent. The crew in the pit stopped working. Everyone looked at the fire. Dorn watched the screen. His face did not change, but his hands tightened. The metal of his gauntlets creaked. Holmes spoke clearly. He explained the timestamps. He explained the weapon signatures. He explained the trajectory of the fleet. He showed the logic of the slaughter. He said that Horus had purged his own legion. He said that Angron, Fulgrim, and Mortarion had done the same. He said the loyalty of the legions was gone. There were only two sides now, those with the Emperor and those with Horus. Dorn shouted. He struck the arm of his throne. The sound was like a cannon shot. He said it was a trick. He said the video could be faked. He looked at Garrow. He called him a traitor. He raised his hand to give the order to his guards. The Huzulkals, his elite Terminators, stepped forward. They raised their storm bolters. Garrow did not flinch. He looked at his Primer. He accepted his death. Watson stepped back. He wanted to hide. This was the end. Holmes slammed his staff on the floor. The sound was sharp. It cut through the tension. He yelled at Dorn. No one yelled at a Primarch, but Holmes did. He told Dorn to look at the math. He told him to look at the logic. He said that denial was a luxury they could not afford. He said that while Dorn argued with reality, Horus was moving. He pointed to the map of the galaxy on the wall. He drew a line with his finger, a line from Isstvan to Terra. He said the Warmaster was coming. He said the shadow was already here. Dorn froze. He looked at the small man in the grey robe. He looked at the map. He looked at the burning world on the screen. The anger drained out of him. It was replaced by something worse. Sorrow. Deep, terrible sorrow. Dorn sat down heavily. The throne groaned under his weight. He looked at his hands. He realized his brother was gone. The brother he loved was dead. In his place was a monster. Dorn looked at Garrow. He told the guards to stand down. He told Garrow he was sorry. Holmes did not smile. He did not celebrate. He looked at the map. The truth was known, but the cost was high. The Phalanx began to move. Engines the size of cities woke up. The floor vibrated. The Imperial fists were mobilizing. They were going to war. But Holmes knew it was late. Too late. He looked at Watson. Watson was pale. He asked what happened next. Holmes looked at the red line on the map. He said the investigation was over. The war had begun. He said they had to send a message to Terra. But he knew the message would not be enough. The air in the room changed. Orders were shouted. Officers ran to their stations. The slow bureaucracy of the Imperium was shifting gears. It was waking up, but it was a slow beast. Holmes watched the activity. He knew the enemy was faster. He knew the enemy did not have to file paperwork. The enemy did not have to wait for permission. The enemy just acted. Holmes felt the weight of his own intellect. He had solved the case. He had found the killer. But the killer had an army, and the killer was coming for them all. Holmes walked to a side console. He began to type a report for Malcador. He used simple words. He stated the facts. He listed the assets lost. He estimated the time of arrival for the traitor fleets. He typed with a steady hand. Watson stood beside him, watching the door. Watson knew his job. He was the bodyguard. He would keep Holmes alive, because Holmes was the only one who saw the whole picture. The Space Marines saw targets. The politicians saw power. Holmes saw the web. He saw how it all connected, and he saw the trap closing. The phalanx turned. Its massive prow faced the Isstvan system. But then it stopped. New orders came. Dorn had made a decision. He would not go to Isstvan. He would send a retribution fleet, but he would take the phalanx to Terra. He would fortify the throne. He listened to Holmes. He understood the scale of the threat. If Horus was coming, Terra had to be a fortress. Holmes nodded when he heard the order. It was the logical choice. It was the cold choice. It meant leaving the loyalists on Isstvan to die, but it saved the capital. Watson asked if they could save the others, the ones left on the planet. Holmes shook his head. He said they were already ghosts. He said their death bought time, and time was the only resource that mattered now. He closed his eyes for a second. He remembered the scream of the dying world. He opened his eyes. They were cold and grey. He was ready for the next move. The game was no longer afoot. The game was war, and in war, the first casualty was always innocence. Watson checked his pistol again. The click was loud in the busy room. Holmes turned to him. He said they had work to do on Terra. He said the enemy was not just outside the walls. The enemy was inside too. He had seen the supply logs. He knew there were spies on the throne world. The hunt was not over. It was just moving to a new location. The rain on Terra tasted like copper. It was acidic and heavy. It fell from clouds that were grey and yellow. The sky was no longer blue. It was choked with industry and fear. Sigillite Holmes stood on a balcony of the Imperial Palace. He watched the construction. The beautiful gardens were being dug up. Trees that were thousands of years old were being cut down. In their place, workers were pouring concrete. They were building bunkers. They were building gun pits. Rogal Dorn was turning the palace into a fortress. It was necessary, but it was ugly. Holmes felt a pain in his chest. It was the pain of watching history die. Watson stood behind him. He was cleaning his bolt pistol. He had new ammunition. It was called Kraken rounds. It was designed to pierce heavy armor. Watson hoped he would not have to use it. He watched Holmes. The detective was staring at a specific crane in the distance. The crane was lifting a massive slab of adamantium. Holmes did not blink. He was counting the seconds it took for the crane to move. He was calculating the weight. He was looking for anomalies. Holmes saw the world as a math problem, and right now, the numbers did not add up. They had returned to Terra 3 days ago. The phalanx had stayed in orbit, a golden moon of war, but Holmes had come down to the surface. He had a meeting with Malcador the Sigillite, the regent of Terra. the second most powerful man in the galaxy. The meeting had been short. Malcador was old and dry like parchment. He sat on a simple wooden chair. He listened to Holmes's report about Isstvan. He did not cry. He did not scream. He simply nodded. He told Holmes that the Retribution fleet had launched. 7 legions were going to Isstvan V to destroy Horus. It was the largest fleet ever assembled. Malcador said it was a hammer that would crush the traitor. But Holmes was not sure. He told Malcador that a hammer was useless if the hand holding it was broken. He showed Malcador the supply logs again. He showed him the missing explosives, not just any explosives. These were seismic charges used for mining asteroids, enough to crack a continent. They had been shipped to Terra 2 months ago, but they were not in the inventories. They had vanished into the maze of the petitioner's city. Malcador gave Holmes a warrant. It was a seal of absolute authority. It allowed Holmes to go anywhere and open any door. Malcador told him to find the bomb. Now on the balcony, Holmes turned to Watson. He said the crane was moving too slow. Watson frowned. He asked why that mattered. Holmes said the crane was rated for 100 tons. The slab was only 50 tons. If the crane was struggling, the load was heavier than it looked, or the machine was sabotaged. Holmes grabbed his staff. He said they had to go down to the roots of the wall. They took a service elevator. It descended for 10 minutes. They went past the opulent halls of the senators. They went past the barracks of the custodes. They went down to the dirty, noisy levels where the workers lived. The air here was hot and smelled of sweat and welding sparks. Thousands of people were moving supplies. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos. Holmes moved through the crowd like a ghost. He did not push. He just found the gaps. Watson followed, using his bulk to clear a path. They reached the base of the crane. It was anchored in a massive foundation block. Technicians in red robes were chanting over the engine. They were Mechanicum adepts. They were blessing the machine with oil. Holmes walked up to the head technician. He showed the warrant. The technician stopped chanting. He looked at the seal. His mechanical eyes whirred. He bowed low. Holmes asked to see the maintenance log. The technician handed over a data slate. Holmes scrolled through it fast. His eyes darted left and right. He stopped. He pointed to an entry. A maintenance check done 4 hours ago. It was signed by Magos Delta 9. Holmes asked where Delta 9 was. The technician said Delta 9 was on a break. Holmes looked at the crane engine. He listened to the hum. It was off-key. He told Watson to get the technician back. He told Watson to clear the area. Watson did not ask questions. He pulled out his badge. He shouted for everyone to move back. The workers looked confused. They did not want to stop working. The schedule was tight. The punishment for delay was severe. But Watson racked the slide of his pistol. The sound was distinct. The crowd moved back. Holmes knelt by the engine housing. He took out a multi-tool from his pocket. He unscrewed the access panel. He did not pray to the machine spirit. He just opened it. Inside, there was a tangle of wires, and there was a box. It was black and sleek. It did not belong there. It was wired into the crane's power core. Holmes looked at it. He recognized the design. It was not Mechanicum. It was Legion Tech. It was a jamming unit. It was designed to send a false signal to the orbital traffic control. Holmes stood up fast. He realized the crane was not the weapon. The crane was the distraction. The jamming unit was creating a blind spot in the orbital grid above this sector. Holmes looked up. Through the smog, he could see the shapes of cargo haulers descending from space. They were bringing stone for the walls. But if the traffic control was blind, a ship could deviate from its path. A ship could crash. or a ship could drop something. Holmes grabbed Watson. He said they were in the wrong place. He said the target was not the wall. The target was the building behind the wall. Watson looked. Behind the construction site stood a tall, needle-like tower. It was the astropathic relay of Sector 4. It was one of the nodes that allowed Terra to speak to the fleets. If it went down, a blind spot would open in the psychic communications network. Holmes ran. He did not run like an old man. He ran with a desperate energy. Watson sprinted to keep up. His bionic legs slammed against the concrete. They reached the base of the relay tower. The guards at the gate were dead. They were not shot. Their throats were cut. The cuts were precise. There was no alarm. The security cameras were looping a peaceful image. Holmes jumped over the bodies. He entered the lobby. It was silent. The air was cold. The elevators were disabled. Holmes looked at the stairs. He started to climb. He had to reach the transmission deck. They climbed 40 floors. Watson was breathing hard. His heavy coat was soaked with sweat. Holmes was pale, but he did not stop. He counted the steps. On the 42nd floor, they found resistance. A door opened. 3 men stepped out. They wore worker jumpsuits, but they moved like wolves. They held las carbines with silencers. They saw Holmes and raised their weapons. Watson reacted first. He did not aim. He fired from the hip. The bolt pistol roared in the enclosed stairwell. The sound was deafening. The first round hit the lead man in the chest. The man exploded. The explosive bolt tore him apart. The other 2 men dived for cover. They returned fire. Last bolts burned the air near Holmes's head. Holmes dropped to the floor. He rolled behind a concrete pillar. He pulled out a small plasma pistol he kept hidden in his sleeve. It was an Archaeotech relic, small but deadly. Watson suppressed the enemy. He fired steady shots, chunk, chunk, chunk. The concrete walls chipped away. The enemy was good. They used cover perfectly. They did not panic. They communicated with hand signals. Holmes watched them. He saw a tattoo on one man's neck, a hydra, the symbol of the Alpha Legion. These were not Space Marines. They were human operatives, but they were trained by the XX Legion. They were deadly. Holmes saw a pipe running along the ceiling. It was a steam pipe. He aimed his plasma pistol. He waited for a gap in the fire. He squeezed the trigger. A blue sun flashed. The pipe ruptured. Scalding steam blasted into the hallway. The operatives screamed. They were blinded. Watson advanced. He walked through the steam like a tank. He fired 2 shots. The screaming stopped. They kept climbing. They reached the top floor. The door to the transmission deck was locked. It was sealed with a gene lock. Holmes looked at the keypad. He did not have a gene key. He looked at the dead guards. He needed a hand, but he did not have time. He looked at the hinges. They were reinforced. He looked at Watson. He pointed to the door. He said, "Knock." Watson holstered his pistol. He took 2 steps back. He charged. He slammed his bionic shoulder into the metal. The door groaned. He did it again. The metal bent. He did it a 3rd time with a roar of effort. The lock snapped. The door flew open. They burst onto the deck. The room was circular. In the center, a group of blind astropaths sat in chairs. They were connected to machines by cables in their skulls. They were chanting, sending messages into the warp. Standing over them were 5 figures in power armor. But the armor was not yellow. It was indigo. It shimmered like scales. They were Alpha Legionnaires, true Space Marines. They were setting charges on the psychic amplifiers. The Legionnaires turned. They moved with a blur of speed. They did not expect intruders. They expected the jammer downstairs to hide them. One of them raised a bolter. Watson fired. His bolt hit the Legionnaire's shoulder pad. It sparked and detonated, but the armor held. The Legionnaire fired back. A bolt hit Watson in the chest. He flew backward. He hit the wall and slid down. His armor vest saved his life, but his ribs were shattered. He coughed blood. Holmes did not fight. He ran. He ran towards the console. The lead Legionnaire swung a combat knife at him. It was a blow that would cut a tank in half. Holmes slid under the swing. He was small and fast. He reached the console. He smashed the emergency purge button. He initiated a psychic backlash. The machine screamed. The astropaths convulsed. A wave of psychic energy exploded from the amplifiers. It was not a weapon, but it was a shockwave. It hit the Legionnaires. It stunned their senses. Their auto-senses flickered white. For a second, they were blind. Holmes grabbed a heavy cable. It was a high-voltage line. He ripped it from its socket. Sparks showered him. He thrust the live end into the pile of explosives the Legionnaires had set. "Run!" Holmes yelled. He dived behind the central dais. The Alpha Legionnaires realized what he had done. They turned to grab the charges. It was too late. The detonator sparked. The explosion was not the total destruction they had planned. Holmes had triggered it early. The charges were not fully primed, but it was enough. The blast blew the roof off the tower. The amplifiers shattered into dust. The astropaths were vaporized instantly. The 5 Legionnaires were thrown out into the open sky, their armor torn open. Holmes was thrown against the far wall. His ears rang. The world was spinning. He looked up. The sky was visible through the hole in the roof. The rain fell on his face. He tried to stand. His leg was broken. He crawled to Watson. Watson was alive. He was groaning. He looked at Holmes. He asked if they won. Holmes looked at the ruined machinery. He looked at the empty chairs where the astropaths had been. He shook his head. They had stopped the tower from falling on the city. They had killed the saboteurs. But the relay was dead. The silence was back. Sector 4 was dark. He dragged himself to the edge of the broken wall. He looked out over the city. In the distance, he saw another flash of light. Then another. Then a third. The explosion in Sector 4 was not the only one. It was a signal. Across the planet, key infrastructure nodes were detonating. A shield generator in the southern hemisphere. A food storage silo in the north. A water purification plant in the mid-hive. Holmes realized the truth. The Alpha Legion had not put all their eggs in one basket. They had 100 baskets. Holmes had found one. He had stopped one, but he could not stop them all. He watched the smoke pillars rise. Each pillar was a wound in the defense of Terra. The vox bead in Holmes's ear crackled to life. It was a general emergency channel. The voice was panic. Proxima relay is down. We have lost contact with the Retribution fleet. Repeat, we have lost contact with the fleet. Holmes closed his eyes. This was the catastrophe. The Retribution fleet was flying into a trap at Isstvan III, and now Terra could not warn them. Terra could not recall them. The eyes of the Imperium had been gouged out. The Alpha Legion had blinded the throne world right before the slaughter began. Watson limped to his side. He held his side. He looked at the fires burning across the horizon. He asked what it meant. Holmes spoke softly. He said it meant they were alone. He said the war was not just coming. The war was here. The enemy was already inside the walls. The enemy was the walls. Holmes looked at the data slate in his pocket. It was cracked, but it still worked. He looked at the pattern of the explosions. They formed a shape on the map. A hydra, the symbol of the Alpha Legion. It was a message. A taunt. We are everywhere. Suddenly, a dropship roared overhead. It was yellow. Imperial fists. A rescue team. Or an arrest team. It didn't matter. The damage was done. The Praetorian, Rogal Dorn, would be furious. He would lock down the planet. He would start a witch hunt. Innocent people would die in the purges. That was part of the enemy's plan too. Paranoia. Chaos. Holmes decided then. He could not fight this war with a gun. He could not fight it with a fleet. He had to fight it with his mind. He had to find the head of the Hydra. He had to find the master spy on Terra. Because if he didn't, the shield over the Imperial Palace would be the next thing to fall. And if the shield fell, the Emperor would be exposed. The dropship landed on the ruined deck. Storm ramps lowered. Terminators marched out. They secured the area. An apothecary ran to Watson. Holmes waved the medic away. He pointed to the console. He told them to salvage the data drives. He told them the enemy had left a trail. It was a lie. The enemy never left a trail. But Holmes needed the Imperial Fist to believe they could win. He needed them to have hope. Hope was a resource too, and they were running low. Holmes looked at the sky one last time. The clouds were darker now. Night was falling on Terra. A long, long night. He checked his internal clock. Based on the warp travel times, the Retribution fleet should be arriving at Isstvan III right about now. He imagined the scene. 7 legions dropping into the atmosphere. The Iron Hands, the Salamanders, the Raven Guard, heroes, legends. He imagined them landing in the Urgal Depression. He imagined them meeting their brothers. He imagined the betrayal. He imagined the massacre. He knew with mathematical certainty that they were all dying right now, and he could do nothing but watch the rain fall on the ruins of a radio tower. The first real catastrophe was not the bomb. It was the silence that followed it. The silence of a million voices crying out, and no one to hear them. Holmes leaned on his staff. He felt old, older than Malcador. He turned to the Terminators. He told them to take him to the Sigillite. He had a new theory. The sabotage was too precise. It required codes that only the High Lords possessed. The traitor was not just a spy. The traitor was one of the High Lords of Terra, or someone who stood at the Emperor's right hand. The suspicion tasted like bile in his mouth, but he swallowed it. He had to follow the logic, even if it led him to the throne itself. The dropship engines whined. They lifted off into the smog, leaving the burning tower behind. The game had turned deadly, and Holmes was just a man in a robe trying to catch gods in a lie. The psychic shockwave hit Terra at dawn. It was not a sound. It was a feeling of sickness. Every astropath in the Imperial Palace screamed at the same time. Many of them died. Their brains burned out. In the dungeons of the Hollow Mountain, the Astronomicon flickered. The great light that guided ships dimmed for a whole minute. People on the streets fell down. They bled from their noses. They did not know why, but Sigillite Holmes knew. He sat in his office in the petitioner's city. He felt the cold shiver in his bones. He looked at his tea. The cup rattled on the saucer. The liquid rippled. Watson was sleeping in a chair. He woke up with a gasp. He grabbed his chest. He said he felt like a grave had opened. Holmes did not look up. He said the grave was open. He said it was very large. He said the Retribution fleet was gone. Watson stared at him. He said that was impossible. 7 legions had gone to Isstvan. Thousands of ships, millions of soldiers. They could not just vanish. Holmes stood up. He walked to the window. He looked up at the sky. He said they did not vanish. They were murdered. The psychic scream was the death cry of 100,000 space marines. The door burst open. A messenger ran in. He wore the livery of Malcador. He was out of breath. He handed a scroll to Holmes. The seal was broken. Holmes read it. His face became like stone. He handed it to Watson. The message was short. It came from a single ship that had escaped. The ship was the Sisypheum. The message said 3 words: massacre, betrayal, flight. It listed the losses. The salamanders were broken. The Raven Guard were scattered. The Iron Hands were dead. Their Primarch, Ferrus Manus, had fallen. The message said the second wave of legions had turned on the first. The Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, the Alpha Legion, and the Word Bearers. They were all traitors. The math had changed instantly. It was not Horus against the Emperor. It was 9 legions against 9. And 3 of the loyal legions were destroyed. Holmes took his coat. He moved fast. He said the game had changed. It was no longer a murder investigation. It was a siege. He said the shockwave was the first domino. The second domino would fall soon. He pointed to the east, towards the night sky where the red planet Mars hung. He said Mars would be next. Watson limped after him. His leg was stiff. The mechanic who fixed it had done a poor job. Supplies were low. Spare parts were being hoarded. They went to the train station. The maglev train was crowded. Refugees were pouring into the palace district. They sensed the fear. The air smelled of unwashed bodies and fear sweat. Holmes and Watson pushed into a cargo car. They sat on crates of ammunition. Holmes took out his data slate. He showed Watson a graph. It tracked the shipments of grain and steel from Mars to Terra. The line went straight down to 0. The shipments had stopped 1 hour ago, right when the psychic scream hit. Holmes explained the chain reaction. Isstvan V was the signal. When Horus revealed his true power, his allies on Mars revealed theirs. The fabricator general Kelbor Ahal had sided with the Warmaster. Now Mars was in civil war. The forges that made the guns and the ships were gone. Terra was cut off. The stomach of the war machine was empty. Holmes said this was the real danger. Armies could fight without leaders. They could not fight without bullets. The train stopped. They were in the distortion district. This was where the great cogitators lived. Machines the size of buildings processed the logistics of the throne world. Holmes led them into a dark alley. Steam hissed from vents. Rats the size of dogs skittered in the shadows. Holmes was looking for a specific junction. He said they had to check the atmospheric regulators. He believed the traitors on Mars had sent a code, a virus made of math. It was called scrap code. It would infect the machines on Terra. If the regulators failed, the air in the palace would turn toxic. They found the entrance to the regulator station. The door was open. That was bad. It should have been locked. Holmes drew his plasma pistol. Watson readied his bolt pistol. They entered. The hallway was dark. The lights flickered with a sickly green color. The air tasted like copper. Watson heard a sound. It was a voice, but it sounded like static. It was gibberish. 0101. Death. 1010. Rot. It came from the speakers. They walked into the main control room. It was a slaughterhouse. The tech priests were dead, but they were not shot. They were torn apart. Their mechadendrites were knotted together. Their metal limbs were fused with the consoles. In the center of the room stood a creature. It used to be a servitor. Now it was a monster. Its flesh was melting. Wires grew out of its skin like worms. It was glowing green. It was typing on the main terminal. It was uploading the virus. Watson fired. The bolt hit the monster in the back. It did not die. It turned around. Its eyes were burning green lights. It screamed a sound that made Watson's teeth hurt. The sound was a weapon. It hit Watson's bionic leg. The leg locked up. The servos whined and sparked. Watson fell to one knee. The scrap code was attacking his own body. The monster charged. It had a circular saw for a hand. Holmes did not shoot. He ran to the console. He knew he could not kill the monster. It was powered by the warp. He had to stop the upload. He typed fast. The keys were hot. The screen was full of nonsense symbols. Holmes used pure logic. He looked for the pattern in the chaos. He found the algorithm. He initiated a hard reset. The monster swung the saw at Watson. Watson rolled. The saw cut into the floor. Sparks flew. Watson kicked the monster with his good leg. It was like kicking a wall of wet cement. The monster raised the saw again. Holmes yelled a command code. It was an ancient override. Omnicia Protect. He slammed his hand on the enter key. The console exploded. A surge of electricity arced through the room. It hit the monster. The green light faded. The monster collapsed into a pile of meat and metal. The scrap code upload stopped at 99%. Holmes fell back. His hands were burned. The skin was red and blistered. He looked at Watson. Watson was trying to stand. His bionic leg was dead weight. He dragged it. Holmes looked at the screen. The atmospheric regulators were safe, but the damage was done. The virus had not taken the air, but it had taken the data. The inventory lists were erased. The defense grid schedules were scrambled. The Imperium was now blind and disorganized. Holmes said this was the plan. Confusion was as good as death. They left the station. They had to carry the news to Dorn. The walk back was slow. Watson used his rifle as a crutch. Holmes was in pain. His hands shook. They saw the sky turn black, not from night but from smoke. The factories in the distance were burning. Sabotage. Everywhere, sleeper cells were waking up. The chain reaction was spreading. They reached the inner wall of the palace. The guards were nervous. They pointed weapons at everyone. Holmes showed his rosette. They let him pass. They went to the strategy room. Dorn was there. He looked different. He looked older. He had heard the news about Isstvan. He was looking at a map of the galaxy. It was covered in red markers. Holmes told him about the scrap code. He told him about the attack on the logic engines. Dorn nodded. He expected this. He said Mars was lost. He said millions were dying on the red planet. The loyalists there were being hunted. He looked at Holmes. He asked what they should do. He was a Primarch, a demigod of war. But he asked a mortal for advice. This showed how desperate the hour was. Holmes looked at the map. He said they had to make a choice, a hard choice. They could not save everything. They had to cut off the infected limbs to save the body. He pointed to the orbital plate above the palace. It was a massive city floating in the sky. It was called the Sky Plate. It held the primary void shield generators. Holmes said the scrap code had infected the plate's link to the ground. If they kept the link open, the virus would come down and shut off the palace power. If they cut the link, the plate would be isolated. The people on it would starve, or they would be defenseless against the traitor fleet when it arrived. Dorn looked at the data. He saw the logic. It was undeniable. He closed his eyes for a second. Then he opened them. He gave the order. Sever the link. A captain relayed the order. High above them, in the upper atmosphere, clamps released. Massive cables detached. The sky plate drifted free. Its lights flickered. It was now a lifeboat in an ocean of sharks. Thousands of crewmen were stranded. Holmes watched the icon on the screen turn yellow, then grey. He felt the weight of those souls. He added them to his mental list, the list of the dead. But the crisis was not over. The chain reaction had one more step. Holmes felt it. He was a detective. He knew how criminals thought, and Horus was the greatest criminal of all. Horus would not just blind them and starve them. He would try to cut off their head. Holmes looked at the roster of the palace staff. He looked for names that did not fit. He looked for gaps in the schedule. He found one. a high-ranking administrator named Aetius. He was in charge of the water reserves. Aetius had missed 3 meetings. His medical file showed a history of headaches, and he had been born on Chthoniya, the same planet as Horus. Holmes told Watson to get up. Watson groaned. He asked if they could rest. Holmes said no. He said the water was next. If the traitors poisoned the water, the siege would end in a week. They took a transport cart. They went deep underground, to the cisterns. The cisterns were huge lakes in caves. The water was dark and still. The air was cold. They found Aetius standing by the edge of the main reservoir. He was holding a canister. It was marked with a symbol of a skull and a fly. It was a biological weapon. Aetius was crying. He was shaking. He did not look like a villain. He looked like a broken man. Holmes walked forward slowly. He held his hands up. He told Aetius to stop. Aetius turned. His eyes were black, totally black, no white. He spoke, but it was not his voice. It was a chorus of whispers. The Lord of Decay sends his gifts. Watson raised his pistol. He could not aim well with his bad leg. His hand wavered. Aetius smiled. He opened the canister. Green gas hissed out. Holmes did not hesitate. He did not try to arrest him. He threw his staff. It spun in the air. It hit Aetius in the face. Aetius stumbled back. He dropped the canister. It rolled towards the water. Holmes dived. He was an old man, but he moved with the speed of fear. He grabbed the canister inches from the water. The metal was freezing cold. The gas was leaking. Holmes covered the nozzle with his hand. The gas burned his palm. He screamed. He threw the canister away from the water onto the stone floor. Watson fired. The bolt hit Aetius in the chest. The man exploded, but not into blood. He exploded into a cloud of flies. The flies buzzed angrily. They formed a shape in the air, a grinning face. Then they dispersed. The presence was gone. Holmes lay on the floor. He was breathing hard. His hand was black from the chemical burn. He wrapped it in a piece of cloth from his robe. He looked at the water. It was clear. They had saved it, but only just. They sat there for a long time. The silence of the cave was heavy. Watson checked his leg. The servos were completely fused. He would need a new one. He looked at Holmes. He asked how many more. How many more traitors were inside the walls? Holmes looked at the dark water. He said he did not know. He said for everyone they caught, 10 more were waiting. The strategic chain reaction was complete. Isstvan had broken the legions. Mars had broken the supply lines. And the scrap code had broken the trust. No one trusted anyone. The palace was full of shadows. Every guard looked at his brother with suspicion. This was the real weapon of chaos. It made you alone. They went back to the surface. The sun was setting. It was a blood-red sunset. The mood in the palace was grim. News was spreading about the skyplate. People whispered that Dorn had abandoned them. Morale was cracking. Holmes saw a group of soldiers arguing. A fistfight broke out. An officer had to fire a warning shot. The discipline was fraying. Holmes went to his quarters. He needed to think. He needed to sleep. But he could not. He sat at his desk. He took out a fresh piece of paper. He wrote a name at the top. Alfarius, the Primarch of the Alpha Legion, the Master of Secrets. Holmes knew Alfarius was behind the sabotage. The Hydra had many heads. Holmes had cut off Aetius. He had cut off the scrap code. But the body was still out there. He realized something terrifying. The attacks were too random. The water, the air, the logic engines. They were distractions. They were meant to keep Holmes and Dorn busy. While they were putting out fires, the real threat was moving into position. Holmes looked at the map of the solar system again. He looked at the outer planets. Pluto, Uranus, Saturn. The defenses there were strong. 3 spheres of defense. But Holmes saw a flaw. The ships guarding Pluto were commanded by Admiral Sukasan. She was loyal, but her vice-admiral was from a guild on Jupiter, a guild that had trade deals with Mars. Holmes drew a line. If the vice-admiral turned, Pluto would fall, and if Pluto fell, the door to the solar system was open. Holmes grabbed his Voxcaster. He tried to call Dorn. The line was dead, static. The scrap code was back. It was evolving. It was learning. Holmes threw the caster against the wall. He felt a rare moment of anger. He was fighting a ghost. He looked at Watson. Watson was asleep on the floor, still in his armor. He looked like a statue of a fallen hero. Holmes felt a pang of guilt. He was dragging this man into hell, but he needed him. He needed his gun and his loyalty. Holmes decided to write a letter to the Emperor. He knew the Emperor was in the dungeons working on his secret project. He knew the Emperor did not take visitors, but Holmes had to try. He wrote down his deductions. He wrote that the war could not be won with armies alone. He wrote that they needed a symbol, a victory, something to break the despair. He sealed the letter with wax. He would give it to a custodian in the morning. It was a long shot, but logic dictated that he use every asset. This ended with a realization. The enemy was not just winning the war. They were rewriting the rules of reality. The laws of physics, of logic, of loyalty, all were melting like the tech priest in the control room. Holmes was a man of order, and he was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into pure chaos. He extinguished the candle. The room went dark. Outside, the sirens began to wail. Another air raid drill. Or maybe not a drill. Holmes did not move. He sat in the dark and calculated the odds. They were dropping. Down, down, down. The strategic situation was catastrophic. The chain reaction had destroyed the stability of the throne world. Now, they were just waiting for the hammer to fall. The winter on Terra was grey and hard. The sun was gone behind the clouds of industry and smoke. It had been 3 months since the shockwave. The panic had settled into a dull ache. People walked with their heads down. They looked at the ground. They saved their energy. Food was rationed. Every citizen got a card. The card gave them bread and water. The bread was stale. The water tasted like recycled metal. Sigillite Holmes did not eat his bread. He gave it to Watson. Watson needed it. The big man was losing weight. His coat hung loose on his frame. His bionic leg was still broken. He used a steel pipe as a crutch. He was in pain, but he did not complain. He cleaned his gun every night. It was the only thing that was clean in their small apartment. Holmes sat at a table covered in paper. He did not use data slates anymore. The scrap code was still in the network. It ate data. It changed numbers. It made lists unreliable. So Holmes went back to paper. He had stacks of shipping manifests, duty rosters, and medical reports. He trusted ink. Ink did not change when you looked away. It was looking for a ghost. The Hydra was still active. The Alpha Legion was still on Terra. They were quiet now. They did not blow up towers. They did not poison the water. They waited. This worried Holmes more than the bombs. A bomb was a statement. Silence was a trap. He found the error on a Tuesday. It was a small thing. A very small thing. It was a report from the navigator's quarter. The navigators were the mutants who guided ships through the warp. They were rich and powerful. They lived in high towers above the smog. The report was about waste disposal. The amount of biological waste from the House of Vilum had increased by 4%. Just 4%. It was nothing. A clerical error. A rounding mistake. But Holmes knew House Vilem. He knew the patriarch, Lord Vilem. The man was obsessed with efficiency. He weighed his food. He weighed his waste. He did not allow errors. A 4% increase meant there were more people in the tower than the census showed, or it meant someone was eating for two. Holmes stood up. He put on his coat. He told Watson to get his gun. Watson asked where they were going. Holmes said they were going to the High City. He said the numbers were speaking. Watson did not ask what they said. He just limped to the door. They took a cargo lift up. The air got cleaner as they rose. The smog turned into a thin mist. The buildings changed from concrete bunkers to marble palaces. This was where the High Lords lived. This was where the power was. The House of Vilem was a fortress of white stone. Guards in gold armor stood at the gate. They were private militia, not imperial army. They had heavy las rifles. Holmes showed his rosette. The seal of Malcador opened all doors. The guards let them in, but they looked hostile. They did not like the Sigillite spies. They did not like the dirty man with the limp. Inside, the palace was silent. Servants moved like shadows. The floors were polished marble. Holmes walked fast. He counted the servants. He looked at their faces. They looked tired. They looked scared. He stopped a maid. He asked her about the patriarch. She looked down. She said the Lord was in meditation. He had not left his chambers for a week. She said he was preparing for the coming storm. Holmes looked at her hands. They were shaking. He asked if the Lord had guests. She said no. No guests. Just the family. Holmes let her go. He whispered to Watson. He said she was lying. She was terrified. They went to the kitchen. Holmes checked the pantry. He saw the food stocks. He did the math in his head. The food consumption matched the waste report. Someone was hiding in the tower. Someone with a big appetite. A Space Marine's appetite. Watson checked the safety on his bolt pistol. He knew what that meant. They moved to the upper levels. The stairs were wide and grand. At the top of the stairs was the door to the Patriarch's chambers. 2 guards stood there. They were not human. They were gene-bulked, vat-grown warriors. Ogryns in plate mail. They held massive axes. They blocked the way. Holmes did not slow down. He held up the rosette. He ordered them to move. The Ogryns did not move. They stared blankly. They were mind-wiped. They only obeyed the Patriarch. Watson stepped forward. He knew he could not fight them in close combat. They would chop him in half. He aimed his pistol at the head of the left Ogryn. He told them to stand down. The Ogryn growled. It raised its axe. Watson fired. The bolt hit the Ogryn in the face. It exploded. The huge body fell backward with a crash that shook the floor. The second Ogryn roared and charged. Watson tried to dodge, but his bad leg failed him. He slipped. Holmes moved. He threw a flash grenade. He had kept it in his sleeve. It detonated with a blinding white light. The Ogryn screamed and covered its eyes. Holmes used his staff. He jammed the end of it into the knee joint of the Ogryn's armor. The joint snapped. The giant fell. Watson fired again from the floor. 2 shots to the chest. The Ogryn stopped moving. The noise was loud. The element of surprise was gone. Holmes ran to the great doors. He pushed them open. The room inside was a navigation sanctum. The walls were glass, looking out at the stars. In the center was a navigation throne. A man sat there. He was tall and thin. He had 3 eyes. The third eye in his forehead was covered by a bandana. This was Lord Vilem. But he was not alone. Standing by the window was a figure in power armor. The armor was blue and green, Alpha Legion. But the helmet was off. The face was plain. It was a face you would forget instantly. The Space Marine was holding a data slate. He was plugged into the house's comms array. He was sending a signal. Lord Vilem looked at Holmes. He was crying. He pointed at the Space Marine. He said he had no choice. He said they took his daughter. Holmes looked at the Space Marine. The Marine did not panic. He smiled. He unplugged the data slate. He crushed it in his hand. He drew a combat knife. It was the size of a sword. "You are late, detective," the Marine said. His voice was smooth. "The message is sent." Holmes analyzed the room. He saw the layout. He saw the cover. He saw the tactical disadvantage. Watson was still in the hallway, getting up. Holmes was alone with the killer. He asked what the message was. The Marine laughed. He said it was not a message. It was a key. The Marine charged. He moved faster than a human eye could follow. Holmes dropped to the floor. The knife slashed the air where his neck had been. Holmes rolled. He grabbed a heavy brass statue of a saint. He threw it. The Marine swatted it away like a fly. Holmes scrambled behind a desk. The Marine kicked the desk. The heavy wood shattered. Holmes was exposed. Watson appeared in the doorway. He fired his last rounds. The bolts hit the Marine's back plate. They detonated. The armor cracked, but it held. The Marine turned. He looked at Watson. He raised his wrist bolter. "No," Holmes shouted. This was the moment of the small choice. Holmes had a weapon. He had his plasma pistol. He had one shot before it overheated. He could shoot the Marine. He could save Watson. It was the instinct of a friend. It was the moral choice. But Holmes saw something else. On the navigation console, a light was blinking. The transmission was done, but the link was still open. The Marine had left the channel open to confirm receipt. If Holmes shot the Marine would die. But the channel would close. Holmes would never know who was on the other end. He would never know what the key opened. Holmes had to choose, save his friend, or get the intel. In the stories, the hero saves the friend. In the stories, loyalty is the highest virtue. But this was not a story. This was history. And history is written in blood. Holmes looked at Watson. Watson looked at him. Watson knew. He saw the calculation in Holmes's eyes. He nodded. A tiny, sad nod. Holmes did not shoot the Marine. He aimed at the console. He fired the plasma pistol. The blue sun hit the machine. The console melted. The link was severed abruptly. The feedback loop surged back through the system. The Marine screamed. The feedback hit his armor systems. He convulsed, but he was not dead. He turned back to Watson. He fired his wrist bolter. 3 shots. Bam! 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 Watson fell. His chest was a ruin. He hit the marble floor. He did not move. The Marine turned back to Holmes. He was angry now. He raised his knife to finish the detective. But the delay had cost him. The noise had drawn others. The window shattered. A yellow form crashed through. It was a Terminator of the Imperial Fists. A Huskell. They had been tracking the energy spike. The Terminator did not ask questions. He fired his assault cannon. The Alpha Legionnaire was torn apart. The fight was over in a second. Holmes did not look at the dead Legionnaire. He crawled to Watson. He held his friend's hand. It was rough and warm. Watson looked up. His eyes were unfocused. He tried to speak. He coughed blood. He asked if they got the bad guy. Holmes lied. He said yes. He said they won. Watson smiled. The light went out of his eyes. The hand went cold. Holmes sat there for a long time. The room filled with soldiers. Medics came. They checked Watson. They shook their heads. They covered him with a sheet. Holmes stood up. He felt hollow. He had made the choice. He had sacrificed his pawn to save the game. He walked to the ruined console. He pulled the data core from the wreckage. He hoped it was worth it. He took the core to the phalanx. He did not trust the computers on Terra. He gave it to Dorn's tech marines. They cracked the code in an hour. Holmes stood on the bridge of the phalanx. Dorn was there. He looked at Holmes. He saw the grief. He did not say anything. He respected the cost of war. The tech marine displayed the data. It was a set of coordinates and a timestamp. Holmes looked at it. His blood ran cold. The message was not a military order. It was a navigational hazard warning, but it was faked. The Alpha Legion spy had sent a signal to the warp boys on the eastern fringe of the galaxy. The signal told the boys to realign, to shift their frequency. It looked like a routine maintenance update, but it wasn't. Holmes looked at the map. He traced the lines. The buoys guided the ships through the warp. Specifically, they guided ships coming from the realm of Ultramar, the 500 worlds, the home of Robert Guilliman, and the Ultramarines. The Ultramarines were the largest legion. They had the most ships. They were the only force large enough to break the Siege of Terra before it began. If they arrived, Horus would be crushed between the anvil of Dorn and the hammer of Guilliman. Horus knew this. The Alpha Legion knew this. The signal Holmes had interrupted was the final activation code. By destroying the console, he had stopped the feedback, but he had not stopped the signal from going out. He had only cut the confirmation. The buoys had already shifted. Dorn looked at the map. He saw what Holmes saw. The route from Ultramar was no longer marked as safe. It was marked as a storm. The ruin storm, Dorn whispered. The warp storms created by the traitors were expanding, but the buoys were the lighthouse. By shifting them, the Alpha Legion had turned off the light. The Ultramarines were now blind. They could not see the path to Terra. They would be lost in the warp if they tried to jump. They were stranded. Holmes realized the magnitude of his failure. He had thought the choice was between Watson and the intel, but the choice had been made minutes before he entered the room. The spy had already won. The delay, the time spent checking the pantry, the time spent fighting the Ogrins, that was the loss. Because they were late, the 13th Legion was removed from the board. The massive outcome was absolute. Terra was alone. No reinforcements were coming. The lion was too far away. The wolf was wounded. And now, the Avenger was lost in the dark. Holmes looked at the stars outside the viewport. They looked cold. He felt the weight of the gun in his pocket. He felt the absence of Watson at his side. He had traded a life for nothing. Dorn turned to his officers. His voice was calm, but it was the calm of a man who sees his own death. Prepare the solar defenses. We stand alone. Holmes left the bridge. He walked to the hangar bay. He watched the shuttle that carried Watson's body leave for the surface. They would bury him in the garden, under the concrete. Holmes did not cry. He did not have tears left. He had only logic. And the logic said they were going to lose. But Holmes was stubborn. He went back to his office. He sat at the desk. He lit a candle. He took out a fresh sheet of paper. He wrote a list of assets. 1. The walls. 2. The custodes. 3. The Imperial fists. 4. The White Scars if they returned. 5. The Blood Angels if they made it. It was a short list. The enemy had 9 legions, demons, titans, and the Warmaster. Holmes stared at the flame. He realized he had been playing the wrong game. He was trying to solve a crime. He was trying to catch spies. But the crime was over. The murder was done. The victim was the Imperium. Now, it was just a fight for survival. He needed to change his thinking. He needed to stop being a detective. He needed to be a soldier. He looked at the map of the solar system. The enemy would come from the warp. They would emerge at the Mandeville points at the edge of the system, Pluto and Uranus. Holmes saw a pattern in the enemy's movements. The Alpha Legion had blinded the sensors. They had cut the supply lines. They had blocked the reinforcements. They were shaping the battlefield. They were funneling the loyalists into a box. Holmes picked up his pen. He began to draw a new plan. If the enemy wanted a box, he would give them a box, but he would put a bomb inside it. He started to design a trap, not for a spy, but for a fleet. He worked for 3 days without sleep. He drank caffeine until his hands shook. He ate nutrient paste. He did not think of Watson. He pushed the grief into a box in his mind and locked it. He became a machine. On the 4th day, he went back to Dorn. He showed him the plan. It was radical. It involved sacrificing the outer planets. It involved pulling the fleet back to Terra. It involved letting the enemy take the ground. Dorn looked at it. He frowned. "This is cowardice," he said. "No," Holmes said. "It is geometry. If you fight them at Pluto, you will lose ships you cannot replace. If you fight them at Uranus, you will lose men you cannot replace. You must bring them here, to the kill zone. You must let them think they have won." Dorn looked at the map. He looked at the firing arcs of the orbital guns. He saw the logic. It was cold. It was cruel. It meant leaving billions of people on the outer colonies to the mercy of the traitors. But it maximized the defensive value of the phalanx. Dorn looked at Holmes. "You have changed, Sigillite." "The times have changed, Lord," Holmes said. "The man who cared about justice is dead. He died with his friend. There is only the mission now." Dorn signed the order. The retreat was sounded. The solar war would not be a series of battles. It would be a collapse. A controlled collapse. The Imperial Navy pulled back. They abandoned the void stations. They abandoned the moons. They formed a sphere of steel around Terra. The enemy arrived a week later. The warp tore open near Pluto. Hundreds of ships spilled out. They were twisted and spiked. They bore the eyes of Horus. They expected a fight. They found empty space. They found silence. They advanced. They took Pluto. They took Uranus. They took Jupiter. They laughed. They thought the false emperor was cowering. They did not see the trap. They did not see the angles. Holmes watched them come on the long-range sensors. He watched the red tide wash over the system. He felt no fear. He felt only a cold, grim satisfaction. He had set the board. He had placed the pieces. Now, the final game would begin. But the cost remained. The choice in the tower echoed. Because of that delay, the Ultramarines were gone. The outcome was massive. The timeline had shifted. The siege would not last months. It would last years. It would be a grinder that chewed up the soul of humanity. Holmes walked to the window of the palace. He looked down at the Eternity Gate. He saw the banners of the Blood Angels. Sanguinius had arrived. The angel was here. That was good. They needed a miracle. Holmes touched the pocket of his coat. He felt the small brass badge he had taken from Watson's body. It was an old badge, a marksman's badge. Holmes rubbed it with his thumb. "The game is ending, John," he whispered to the empty room. "But the night is just beginning." He turned back to the dark. He had one more investigation to run. One more mystery. The Emperor. The master of mankind had been silent for too long. Holmes needed to know why. He needed to know what was happening in the dungeons, because if the Emperor fell, no walls would save them. Holmes walked out of the room. He headed down past the cisterns, down past the tombs, down to the golden throne. He had to see the face of God. He had to know if God was still awake. The guards tried to stop him. The custodies blocked his path. Their spears were sharp. Their gold armor shone in the gloom. Holmes did not stop. He held up the rosette. "I am the eye of the Sigillite," he said, "and I must see." The custodies looked at each other. They lowered their spears. They let him pass. They knew the end was near. They knew rules did not matter anymore. Holmes walked into the thrumming heat of the throne room. The light was blinding. The noise was a roar of psychic fire. And there, on the mountain of machinery, sat the Emperor. Holmes looked, and for the first time in his life, his logic failed him. He did not see a man. He saw a sun in agonizing pain. He saw a dying star holding back the dark. And he realized the truth. The outcome of the war did not depend on ships or walls. It depended on the will of one being who was screaming in silence. Holmes fell to his knees. The heat burned his skin. The light blinded him. He understood now. The investigation was irrelevant. The strategy was irrelevant. They were all just dust in the wind of a god's dying breath. But Holmes stood up. He forced himself to stand. He was dust, but he was thinking dust, and as long as he could think, he would fight. He turned away from the light. He walked back to the shadows. He had work to do. He had to organize the defense of the Eternity Gate. He had to buy the dying star one more hour, one more minute. He walked with a limp now. He mimicked his friend without knowing it. He walked into the dark. The Siege of Terra had lasted for 55 days. The palace was no longer a palace. It was a mountain of rubble and iron. The sky was a constant storm of fire. Orbital lasers hammered the void shields every second. The sound was not like thunder. It was like the world was cracking open. Sigillite Holmes stood in the command bunker of the Bab Bastion. The floor shook constantly. Dust fell from the ceiling in a steady rain. His grey robe was black with soot. He leaned on his staff. He looked at the main tactical table. The lights on the map were mostly red. Red meant enemies. Green meant loyalists. The red ocean was swallowing the green islands. Rogal Dorn stood on the other side of the table. His golden armor was dented and scorched. He had not slept in weeks. He looked at the western wall. It had fallen an hour ago. The World Eaters were pouring through the breach. They were killing everything. Dorn moved a marker on the map. He ordered the White Scars to counterattack. His voice was flat. He was running out of soldiers. He was running out of wall. Holmes watched the markers move. He did the math in his head. He calculated the rate of attrition. He calculated the ammunition reserves. He calculated the structural integrity of the Eternity Gate. The numbers were clear. They had 3 days. In 3 days, the traitor legions would reach the inner sanctum. In 3 days, the Emperor would be exposed. There was no way to stop it. The enemy had too many bodies. They had demons that did not die when you shot them. They had titans that crushed buildings like toys. The door to the bunker opened. Sanguinius walked in. The angel, the Primarch of the Blood Angels. His white wings were stained with smoke and blood. He held his sword loosely. He looked beautiful and terrible. He walked to the table. He looked at Holmes. He nodded. Sanguinius knew. He had the gift of foresight. He saw the end coming. He did not look afraid. He looked sad. A Vox officer shouted from the communications pit. He said there was a signal, a new signal. It was not from the surface. It was from orbit. It was from the Vengeful Spirit, the flagship of the Warmaster. The officer said the void shields of the ship were down. Dorn froze. He looked at the officer. He asked him to repeat the message. The officer said it again. The shields were down. A section of the ship was open to teleportation. It was a clear path. It was an invitation. Dorn slammed his fist on the table. He said it was a trap. He said Horus was mocking them. He said if they tried to teleport, they would be scattered and killed. He looked at Sanguinius. He asked for his brother's opinion. Sanguinius looked at the ceiling. as if he could see through the rock to the ship in space. He said it was a trap, but it was also a duel. He said Horus was waiting. Holmes stepped forward. He tapped the map with his staff. He spoke softly. The room went quiet. He said they had to look at the timeline. He reminded them of the Alpha Legion attack. He reminded them that the Ultramarines were delayed by the ruin storm. He pointed to the edge of the system map. There was no sign of Guilliman's fleet. They were weeks away, maybe months. Holmes said this was the key. Horus knew Guilliman was coming. Horus knew he could not win a long war. If the Ultramarines arrived, the traitors would be crushed. Horus had to win now. He had to kill the Emperor before the relief fleet arrived. But he could not break the Eternity Gate fast enough. So he lowered his shields. He was gambling. He was betting that the Emperor would come to him. Dorn argued. He said they should wait. He said they should hold the line. Holmes shook his head. He showed Dorn the numbers, the attrition rate. The walls would fail before Guilliman arrived. If they waited, they died. If they attacked, they might die, but they had a chance. It was the only logical move. It was the move Holmes had failed to prevent when he let the spy send the signal. The delay of the 13th Legion forced the Emperor to fight. The door at the back of the room opened. A golden light spilled out. It was blinding. The custodies knelt. The Emperor walked in. He was not a giant in armor this time. He looked like an old man in simple robes, but his eyes were full of power. He walked to the table. He looked at the map. He looked at the vengeful spirit. He spoke. His voice sounded like 1,000 voices. He said the time had come. He said he would go. He would take Sanguinius and Dorn. They would teleport to the ship. They would kill the Warmaster. It was the final roll of the dice. Holmes watched the Emperor. He saw the grim determination, but he also saw the cost. To leave the palace, the Emperor had to leave the Golden Throne. The throne held the webway portal shut. Behind the portal, millions of demons were waiting to flood Terra. If the Emperor stood up, the door would open. Terra would be consumed by the warp. Malcador, the Sigillite, walked in behind the Emperor. He was frail. His skin was like paper. He carried a staff with a burning eagle on top. He looked at Holmes. He smiled, a thin, dry smile. He said he would take the seat. He would sit on the Golden Throne. He would hold the door shut with his own mind. Holmes felt a cold shiver. He knew what that meant. The Golden Throne burned the souls of those who sat on it. It required the strength of a god. Malcador was powerful, but he was not a god. He was a man. He would burn. He would die. Holmes walked to Malcador. He asked if there was another way. Malcador shook his head. He said this was the duty. He handed Holmes a small data key. He said it contained the final records of the Officio Assassinorum. He told Holmes to keep the history safe. He said someone had to remember the truth after the heroes were gone. The preparations began. It was chaotic. Teleportation arrays were charged. Terminator squads were assembled. The air crackled with energy. Holmes stood in the corner. He felt useless. He was a man of logic in a room of myths. He had no sword. He had no powers. He just had his mind. Then the air shifted next to him. A figure appeared. It was not a soldier. It was a shape made of blue smoke and shifting glass. It was a daimon of Siege, the changer of ways. No one else saw it. The psychic shielding of the room was focused on the Emperor. The demon slipped through the cracks. The demon spoke in Holmes's mind. It did not threaten him. It offered him a gift. It showed him a vision. It showed him a universe of perfect order. A universe where Watson was alive. A universe where the war never happened. It showed him the solution to the ultimate puzzle. It showed him the grand equation of reality. All Holmes had to do was say one word. All he had to do was tell Dorn that the shields were a hologram. If he lied, the Emperor would stay. The attack would be cancelled. Holmes looked at the vision. It was beautiful. It was logical. It was everything he ever wanted. A world where things made sense. But he looked at the edges of the vision. He saw the price. The price was slavery. The price was the loss of free will. In a perfect clockwork universe, there is no choice. And if there is no choice, there is no humanity. Holmes looked at the demon. He whispered. He said that a puzzle with no solution is torture, but a puzzle that solves itself is boring. He said he preferred the mess. He preferred the pain, because the pain was real. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out the small brass badge, Watson's badge. He held it tight. The metal bit into his palm. The pain grounded him. He looked at the demon and said, "No." The demon screeched. It shattered like glass. The vision vanished. Holmes was back in the bunker. He was sweating. He had passed the final test. He had rejected the temptation of the warp. He had chosen the hard truth over the beautiful lie. The Emperor signaled the ready status. Sanguinius unfurled his wings. Dorn revved his massive chainsword. They stood on the teleportation platform. The Emperor looked at Holmes one last time. He nodded. It was a nod of respect, from the master of mankind to the detective. Then the light flashed. There was a sound like a thunderclap inside a jar. They were gone. The room was empty. Just the technicians and Holmes. And Malcador. Malcador walked to the lift that led down to the throne. He looked very old. Holmes walked with him. They went down in silence. The noise of the war faded. The heat grew. They reached the Sanctum Imperialis. The golden throne loomed above them. It was a machine the size of a cathedral. It was covered in pipes and wires. The Emperor's connection was severed the moment he teleported. The machine began to scream. Alarms wailed. The psychic backlash shook the walls. The demons behind the portal began to push. The reality of the room started to warp. Frost appeared on the hot pipes. Shadows danced on the walls. Malcador climbed the steps. He sat on the throne. The interface spikes drove into his spine. He gasped. His back arched. The machine roared. Psychic fire engulfed him. His skin began to wither instantly, but he held. He focused his will. The portal slammed shut. The demons were pushed back. The shaking stopped. Holmes stood at the foot of the throne. He watched his master burn. He could not look away. This was the murder, the ultimate murder, and he was the witness. He took out his notebook. He wrote down the time. He wrote down the readings on the displays. He chronicled the sacrifice. Hours passed. The war above raged on, but Holmes did not see it. He only saw the man on the chair. Malcador was turning to dust. His flesh was flaking away. His bones were visible, but his mind held. He was keeping the planet alive. Then the psychic wave hit. It came from space. It was the death scream of a Primarch. Sanguinius, the angel, had fallen. Holmes felt the sorrow wash over him. It was like losing a piece of the sun. Malcador groaned. The fire flared brighter. He was fading fast. Another wave hit. This one was different. It was dark and cold. It was Horus. The Warmaster was dying. The Emperor had struck the killing blow. The shadow was lifting, but the cost was coming. The teleportation flare lit up the room again. Figures appeared. Rogal Dorn. He was carrying a body, the body of the Emperor. The Emperor was a wreck. His armor was melted. His arm was gone. His face was a mask of blood. But he was alive. Just barely. Dorn yelled for the tech priests. He yelled for the apothecaries. He ran to the throne. He looked at Malcador. He had to switch them. He had to put the Emperor back on the throne to save his life, but removing Malcador would kill him. Malcador opened his eyes. They were burned holes. He spoke. His voice was a dry whisper. He said he was ready. He said his duty was done. Dorn gently lifted the Emperor. The tech priest prepared the connections. Holmes stepped forward. He helped lift Malcador from the seat. The body was as light as ash. As soon as the connection broke, Malcador crumbled. He literally fell apart. He turned into a pile of grey dust in the Holmes's arms. Holmes held the dust. He fell to his knees. The Sigillite was gone. The greatest mind of the age was just grit on the floor. Dorn placed the Emperor on the throne. The machine stabilized. The Emperor's psychic might took over. The light returned, but it was a cold light. The Emperor did not speak. He did not move. He was a statue of pain. Dorn fell back. He sat on the steps. He wept. The Praetorian of Terra, the man of stone, cried like a child. He had failed. He had not saved his father. He had not saved his brothers. Holmes stood up. He brushed the dust of Malcador from his robe. He put the dust in a small pouch. He would bury it later. He looked at Dorn. He looked at the silent Emperor. He realized the investigation was over. The case was the death of hope, and the killer was everyone. It was Horus. It was the Emperor. It was the Primarchs. It was the nature of the galaxy itself. Holmes walked to the main console of the throne room. He found the master log. He had to close the file. He had to write the conclusion. He typed with one hand. His other hand held the pouch of dust. He wrote, "The siege is broken. The traitors are fleeing. The Warmaster is dead. But the victory is a lie. We have traded a quick death for a slow one. The Imperium survives, but it is a corpse. It will rot. It will hate. It will forget." Ascent. He looked at the date. It was the first day of a new era, an era of darkness. A captain of the Imperial Fists ran into the room. He told Dorn that the traitor fleet was breaking orbit. The sons of Horus were retreating. They were taking the body of the Warmaster with them. The Ultramarines had arrived at the edge of the system. Guilliman was here. Dorn did not look up. He said, "Let them go." He said it didn't matter. Holmes walked over to the captain. He took command. He told the captain to secure the gates. He told him to begin the purge of the traitor cells on the planet. He told him to burn the bodies of the dead. He spoke with the voice of the Sigillite. He was the successor now. He was the keeper of secrets. He walked out of the sanctum. He walked back up to the surface. The sun was trying to break through the clouds. The fires were dying down. The silence was returning. But it was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of a graveyard. Holmes walked to the section of the wall where Watson had died. It was buried under rubble. He climbed to the top of the pile. He looked out over the ruins of the petitioner's city. He saw the millions of dead. He took out his pipe. He did not light it. He just held it. He thought about the logic of the universe. He thought about the demon's offer, a perfect world. He looked at the ruin in front of him. This world was broken. It was ugly. It was full of pain. But it was theirs. "The game is over, Watson," he said to the wind. "We lost." But then he looked at the sky. He saw a single Imperial transport ship descending. It was carrying food. It was carrying medicine. It was landing in the ruins. People were coming out of the bunkers. They were helping each other. They were sharing water. Holmes watched them. He saw a mother feeding her child. He saw a soldier digging a survivor out of the rocks. He corrected himself. "No," he whispered. "We survived. And in this galaxy, survival is the only victory." He turned back to the palace. The work was just beginning. The history had to be written. The lies had to be told to keep the Imperium together. The Emperor had to be turned into a god. because a man could not rule from a coffin. Holmes would write the holy books. He would create the Inquisition. He would do the dirty work that logic demanded. He was no longer a detective. He was the High Lord of the Administratum. He was the icy intellect that would keep the corpse of the Empire from falling apart. He walked into the shadows of the palace. His limp was heavy. His face was like a skull. He disappeared into the dark, leaving the dawn behind him. The investigation into the Horus Heresy was closed. The long war had begun. The archives of the Imperial Palace were deep and cold. They smelled of dry paper and forgotten lives. 10 years had passed since the siege. The reconstruction was ongoing, but the scars on the planet would never truly heal. Sigillite Holmes sat at a desk made of black iron. He was very old now. His hair was white and thin. His hands were spotted with age and ink stains. He was the master of the Administratum, one of the High Lords of Terra. He was the most powerful bureaucrat in the galaxy. He hated it. On the desk in front of him sat a stack of leather-bound notebooks. They were handwritten. They contained the truth. They contained the transcript of the video from the Eisenstein. They contained the chemical analysis of the virus bombs. They contained the logic that proved the Emperor had failed. They were the case files of the Horus Heresy. Holmes picked up the first book. He opened it. He read a passage about a conversation with Watson regarding the nature of hope. He closed the book gently. He stood up and walked to the incinerator chute in the wall. The chute led directly to the plasma furnaces deep in the planet's crust. Holmes held the book over the opening. He did not hesitate. He dropped it. He watched it fall into the red glow. He went back to the desk. He picked up the next book. One by one, he dropped them. He was destroying the evidence. He was the detective who solved the crime. And now, he was the cleaner who hid the body. He knew that the Imperium could not survive the truth. If the common people knew that the arch-traitor was the Emperor's favorite son, their faith would break. If they knew that the Emperor was a man who made mistakes, their loyalty would shatter. They needed a god. They needed a devil. They needed a simple story of good and evil. Holmes was giving them that story. He was trading logic for myth. It was the ultimate sacrifice of his principles. He was killing the truth to save the human race. When the last book was gone, Holmes sat back in his chair. The room felt empty. The ghost of Watson was fading. The memory of the phalanx was fading. Even the face of the Emperor was becoming a blur in his mind, replaced by the golden mask on the throne. Holmes picked up a quill. He had one last document to write. It was the founding charter for a new order, an order of men and women who would hunt for threats in the dark, who would ask no questions and show no mercy. He wrote the title at the top of the parchment, The Holy Orders of the Emperor's Inquisition. He signed his name at the bottom, but he did not sign it as Holmes. He signed it as a servant of the throne. He sanded the ink. He looked at the shadows in the corner of the room. He whispered to the silence. He said the case was closed. He said the suspect was at large. He said the investigation would continue forever. He stood up and blew out the candle. The room went dark. In the darkness, the machinery of the Imperium ground on. A blind giant stumbling forward, guided by the lies of a man who loved the truth too much to let it live.